Okay, thank you very much, Julie. And I should say that the series that I did, I initiated it together with Mingye Rawnsley, who's now over in Ningbo in China. And in its second iteration, I've been working together with Corrado Neri from Lyon 3, and also Wafa Germani from the Cinémathèque Française. So there's been a bunch of us that work on this. I will introduce what Taiyupian are, and I'm also going to talk about them as a kind of Cold War cinema. What I'm going to try and do now, fingers crossed, is share screen with the PowerPoint. So let's see how we go.
It looks good.
Yeah, it's just because. Except it's not responding. Okay, just a bit slow. It's got there eventually. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay. All right, so please bear with me. This is going to be a bit of a lecture. I've taken it out of a chapter that is under consideration at the moment. And I just wanted to read it out so that I could be coherent and you can follow me. So the term Taiyupian, Taiwanese language films, refers to a cycle of dramatic features made between the late 1950s and the early 1970s in the Minnanhua Sinitic language. Minnanhua was the first spoken language of the vast majority of the Han Chinese inhabitants of the island who were already there before the end of the 50 years of Japanese colonization in 1945. The KMT nationalist government of China that took over after the Japanese were defeated promoted Mandarin as the national language, but very few people on the island actually spoke that at the time or understood it. While the government, when it got interested in cinema, supported Mandarin film production in state-owned studios, a host of undercapitalized and often short-lived private companies made over 1,000 Taiyupian until various factors led to the death of the industry in the early 1970s. Probably the most important factor was the rise of television, but there were other factors too. There was no film archive at that time, and only just over 10% of the films made survived. So it's a very shockingly small number. But thanks to the recent efforts of the Taiwan Film and Audio Visual Institute, who've been restoring them, excuse me, and also digitizing them and subtitling them, they've become more available to us now. Now, the existing scholarship on Taiyupian tends to understand them largely within a domestic Taiwanese framework. It sees it as a mainlander, local islander confrontation, placing the Mandarin language films on the mainlander KMT government side and the Taiyupian on the local islander side, the side of the population that had been there for 50 years. On the other hand, scholars who work on the Cold War in Taiwan tend to treat that as an international matter, focusing on the confrontation between the KMT government and their communist rivals on the mainland. As I'm sure you're aware, the KMT claimed for a long time to continue to be the legitimate government of the whole of China, including Taiwan. And the CCP said, no, we're the legitimate government of the whole of China, including Taiwan. And so most existing scholarship on the Cold War leaves out the issue of the islanders. And when culture comes in around Cold War scholarship, it tends to focus on the Mandarin films that were so-called anti-communist films, of which quite a large number were made by the government studios throughout the martial law era. I wanted to try and find a poster of one of these anti-communist films that was made during the same time the Taiyupian were being made, but I couldn't find one of those. But I found this Battle of Guningtou, which is about the Jinmen and Matsu Islands, not far off the coast with Fujian province. So, as I say, when cinema gets mentioned in relation to the Cold War in Taiwan, it's mostly those anti-communist films. Now, today, I want to argue that Taiwanese language cinema also needs to be understood both as part of transnational cinema culture, not just a domestic issue, and more specifically, in that transnational dimension, as a Cold War cinema. I'm going to examine how the Taiwanese language cinema was shaped by the Cold War in two primary ways today. First, I want to talk about how it shaped the production, distribution, and exhibition circumstances of Taiyupian by dividing the natural market and making the industry both a beneficiary and sometimes a victim of Cold War cultural policy by the Taiwan government. And second, I'm going to spend a bit more time demonstrating that the films themselves are not just part of a generalized post-war cosmopolitan culture, but more specifically, part of the Taiwan Cold War cosmopolitan popular culture of the Minnanhua speaking population. So now I'm going to jump over a large chunk in my original paper where I discuss the existing scholarship. I won't bore you with that. And I'm going to go in now to my discussion of how the industry was shaped by the Cold War. As an industry, the Taiwanese language cinema found itself both the accidental beneficiary and victim of the Cold War and various government policies associated with it, responding tactically to the possibilities and pitfalls opened up by national strategy. Most fundamentally, the so-called bamboo curtain divided the Minnanhua speaking population. And you can see this map, which shows part of the coastline of mainland China and the island of Taiwan, and in dark green in particular, but also light green, but the different Minnanhua speaking populations and where they tend to be concentrated. So the bamboo curtain goes straight down the sea between Taiwan and mainland China and divides what is the natural market for any cinema in Minnanhua. On the one hand, this Cold War division limited the potential export market for Taiyupian. On the other hand, it meant that Taiwan had the largest Minnanhua speaking population on the capitalist side of the Cold War divide. This population was catered to in the early 1950s by films made in Hong Kong, in the variant of Minnanhua spoken and traced back to the area around the city of Xiamen, in what was known as the Amoy or Xiayu film industry. But this language was equally understandable by audiences on Taiwan. And so the success of these Hong Kong imports on Taiwan prompted local stage producers to try their hand at filming stage dramas in the mid-1950s. They started out with recordings of local goahi or gezaishi operas on what turned out to be the correct assumption that these would appeal to Taiwan audiences. With a natural market advantage, Taiwan quickly eclipsed Hong Kong as the dominant producer of Minnanhua films, known as Taiyupian, but still without access, of course, to that larger population of Minnanhua speakers on the mainland. Once established, the Taiwanese language film industry experienced a series of ups and downs before its eventual demise in the 1970s. The precise reasons for these shifting fortunes are much debated among scholars. The KMT government certainly did not offer anything like the consistent support it offered to the Mandarin language cinema. For example, through the KMT's own Central Motion Picture Corporation, it owned that corporation. Furthermore, many of the policies either created obstacles for Taiyupian producers, and so it complicated the situation. Now, for example, among these policies that had a complicated effect, although the KMT government was, of course, in alliance with Japan as a result of the Cold War, for most of its history on the mainland, they'd been deadly enemies at war with each other. Committed to re-Sinicize and de-Japanize the island, which the KMT insisted was simply another Chinese province, they blew hot and cold in their attitude towards Japanese cultural imports. Sometimes they allowed them ready access to the Taiwan market, and sometimes they imposed heavy quotas and import taxes. The main market for Japanese films, once they were imported into Taiwan, was the islander population, most of whom had been educated in Japanese during the Japanese colonial era when they were growing up. They found films in Japanese easier to understand than the government-sponsored Mandarin language films, and they were familiar with Japanese culture. As a result of this situation, we can see an interesting pattern where the two waves of Taiwanese language cinema, the first in the late 1950s and the second taking off after 1962, correlate to when Japanese imports are blocked from coming in. In other words, when the KMT says no to the Japanese imports, the Taiwanese language films do well. When the Taiwanese speaking audience can see the Japanese films they love, they don't go to the Taiwanese films quite so much. So that's one important thing there. The reason I picked this particular still from The Husband's Secret to show you is, of course, just to look at how Japanese that house is, with tatami mats and screens and all the rest of it. And also the characters sitting on the floor, which is, again, something that you do in Japan and Korea, but you don't do so much in China. The floor is not seen as a clean place to sit on at all in China. And when I show this film to mainland Chinese audiences, they always notice this. They're sitting on the floor. So anyway, some scholars now have noted other policy reasons that may have to do with the ups and downs of Taiyupian. And again, they very often have to do with KMT policies that are Cold War influenced. I'm not going to go through them in detail now, but for example, the KMT also created policies that made it very favorable for right-wing Hong Kong-based filmmakers who are making Mandarin films to come and work in Taiwan and also to be able to import their films. And that also did not favor the Taiwanese language filmmakers. So you can begin to see how, as an industry, there is this pattern where it's shaped by Cold War policies and the Cold War itself. Now, what do we see in the films themselves? The films produced by the Taiwanese language cinema also show characteristics of the islander population's complex relationship with the logic of the Cold War. First, there's a sharp contrast between the strong ideological commitment to the Cold War on the part of the Mandarin language cinema supported by the KMT government. In other words, those anti-communist films I've already mentioned, and the general silence on the national and international Cold War issues in the Taiwanese language cinema itself. The large majority of the islander population that were the primary market for films made in Taiwan had never had any direct contact or conflict with the Chinese Communist Party, and they had little direct stake in what happened on the mainland. The market was paramount for Taiyupian producers, so it's unsurprising that it's difficult to find anti-communist content in the films of the Taiwanese language cinema. There's one possible exception, and this is the film Fantasy of the Deer Warrior. You can see an image there from this sort of proto-cosplay film from 1960 that fascinates audiences with its actors dressed up in animal costumes. It's sometimes understood as a sort of Aesop's Fable style children's film, and there's no other film like it in either Taiwanese language cinema or Mandarin language cinema. While the sika deer and the elk, the young males among the forest animals, are fighting over a doe, the young doe there in the arms of one of the, I'm not sure if that's the sika deer or the elk, I think it's the sika deer. While they're fighting over her, a pack of marauding wolves set on the little lambs played by children in the film and carry them away to club them to death and eat them. Although the animals regroup to defend themselves against future attacks, they're betrayed by a fox. The interpretation of this plot as having a contemporary meaning in the time is allegorical rather than symbolic, because there's nothing in the film or the culture of the times to fix how we should read this fable. One way of understanding the film is as a parable warning the people of Taiwan against the dangers of internal dissent and traitors in the face of the threat of communist invasion. However, interestingly, when the restored version of the film with subtitles was shown around Taiwan recently, at least one young cinephile on his blog wrote rather differently. And he said, "This film obviously satirizes the KMT government. The brother and hero of the hero Sika deer, the father and brother of the hero Sika deer represented brave Taiwanese who dared to resist the evil KMT, and the wild wolf certainly refers to the KMT and their government." So I think that's quite an interesting modern interpretation. I'm not sure that's how people would have seen it at the time. Now let me talk a little bit more about some other ways in which the Cold War shapes the content of the films. Although directly anti-communist films are absent from the Taiwanese language cinema, and there's silence on the ideological basis of the Cold War conflict, it's not the case that the Taiwanese language films are completely free from Cold War influence. Indeed, I would argue that they exhibit a distinctly Taiwanese form of Cold War cosmopolitanism, to borrow a term that Christina Klein has used about South Korean cinema in a really interesting book she published recently, and Kenny Ng has been using to write about 1950s Hong Kong cinema. I would say that Taiwanese language cinema manifests a distinctively Taiwanese form of Cold War cosmopolitanism. And so in the rest of this talk, I want to demonstrate how that distinctive formation can be observed in the narrative sources that it borrows and adapts and draws inspiration from, the borrowings of non-diegetic music, and the sources of the settings, costumes, and general mise-en-scène of the film, and the dramatic tensions generated by changing values within this cosmopolitan environment. So first, let me talk a bit about Cold War cosmopolitan sources. Considering sources first, Hollywood popular genres were certainly important. An example would be Tarzan and the Treasure, a 1965 film, which features a Taiwanese Tarzan, Jane, and boy, not in Africa, but in Malaysia, in the highland forests of Malaysia. If you haven't seen this film and you get a chance to see it, please do. It's fascinating and hilarious. And also very interestingly invested in Taiwan's Japanese heritage as well, because the treasure is Japanese gold that has been buried by the Japanese Imperial Army, supposedly, up in the highlands in Malaysia. Other more exotic Western sources were also used. For example, The Bride Who Has Returned from Hell is adapted from the Gothic romance Mistress of Mellon by the British author Victoria Holt. Originally published in English only 5 years before the film was made, the rapid process of not only translation into Chinese, but also transposition into a Taiwanese context is evidence of Taiwan's participation in the profit-driven circulation of popular culture on the capitalist side of the Cold War divide. And also just how quickly this moved. There's not, it doesn't make any sense to talk about a lag. This is very much a coeval manifestation. Although Western sources were drawn on, more frequently used materials were closer to home. After the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Hong Kong became the new center of the Chinese film world on the capitalist side of the bamboo curtain. Chun Ji-Wang has written about the aspirations and experiences of Taiwanese language film stars who try to rebuild their careers by breaking into the Hong Kong industry. If you became a really big star in Taiwan, your next step was to try to go to Hong Kong. Filmmakers did the same. They also worked in Hong Kong and with the Hong Kong industry when the opportunity came. And then it shaped their filmmaking practices when they returned to Taiwan. For example, Chen Hongmin, the director of Vengeance of the Phoenix Sisters, a martial arts film, had edited the Hu Jin Chuan or King Hu classic Dragon Inn a year before in 1967 in Hong Kong. And born in the mainland, King Hu had fled to Hong Kong to avoid the communists and later worked a lot on Taiwan. Finally, even more important than as a source of material than either Hong Kong or Hollywood was Japan. And I already mentioned that The Husband's Secret was adapted from a Japanese novel. Some of the most prominent Taiwanese language film directors, including both Xin Qi and Lin Tuan-chiu, who is the director of The Husband's Secret, had studied and trained in theater and or film in Japan during the colonial era. And they were both born when Taiwan was a Japanese colony in Taiwan. Chen Hongmin, the guy who I just mentioned who directed Vengeance of the Phoenix Sisters, also trained in Japan after the war. A considerable proportion of the audience for Taiwanese language cinema was educated during the colonial era when they learned Japanese and grew up surrounded by Japanese popular culture. Given these circumstances, it's not surprising that many Taiwanese language films resemble Japanese popular films in many ways, and sometimes were even remakes. For example, Lin Tuan-chiu's noirish detective film, his last film, Six Suspects, is a remake of Inoue Umetsugo, 1961 film, which has the same name. Of course, Lin Tuan-chiu transposes it and moves it to Taiwan. But the plot, from what I can tell, is broadly similar. I've only been able to find a synopsis of the Japanese original. I haven't yet been able to see the Japanese film. Now, having talked about sources, and by the way, I like this poster a lot because of the emphasis on the house, which of course in Gothic writing and Gothic films, the house, the supposedly haunted house is always very important. And this is for Bride Who Has Returned from Hell. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about non-diegetic music. Now, the borrowings and hybridizations of music in Taiwanese language cinema are really, I would say, promiscuous and complex, and probably worthy of analysis by a musicologist. Now, clearly, in the early films, the ones that were based on Taiwanese opera, that is very much marked as Taiwanese. But very quickly, once they start making genre films, comedies, romances, melodramas, music from other sources appear. The range is impressive, like the scripts themselves, but it's always musical cultures from the capitalist side of the Cold War divide. And that's also true for the literary sources or cinematic sources for the plots, always on the capitalist side of the Cold War divide. Now, sometimes these borrowings are very direct. When the wolves attack the little lambs in Fantasy of the Deer Warrior, Mars, the bringer of war, from Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite suddenly looms up on the soundtrack. When the little lambs are playing, the jaunty American Christmas carol, Jingle Bells, is heard. Now, you've got to remember, these films were made for very low budgets, and I suspect sometimes the sound was used by simply putting a record on the record player and recording the sound and then laying it on the soundtrack. Maybe I'm being overly cynical, but they certainly didn't have the money for an orchestra or anything like that. I think there's a sort of opportunistic grabism, to use Lu Xun's term, nālaizhī, that we can even talk about in the way in which Taiwanese filmmakers looked for whatever they could find and use. In The Bride Who Has Returned from Hell, when one of the characters is lost and in the middle of the night, and it's a spooky scene with suspense, and everyone rushes out to look for her, the Bond theme from Dr. No is heard to add suspense. And I think it's comic for us, but I think it was probably also comic for the audience at the time. Don't think they weren't seeing James Bond films then, they were. Maybe less obvious and in your face, but much more common than these striking appropriations of Western music are various kinds of enka stylings or translations and adaptations of Japanese popular music. Sometimes it's directly Japanese tunes, but with the lyrics translated into Minnanhua. Sometimes it's a locally composed enka style song. Latin beats are not uncommon, especially for nighttime scenes and nightclub scenes. And what appears local often has complex roots. As Guojun Hong, the scholar of Taiwan cinema, argues, many of the films were truly hybrid, absorbing traditional opera, Japanese and mainland Chinese influences, as well as assimilating Western classical music, rock and roll, and jazz. Now I'm going to move on to the mise-en-scène. One of the settings that Lin Tuan-Chou's Six Suspects returns to frequently is a small restaurant, and here's a still from it. With its sushi bar, noren door curtain, sake-style liquor serving bottles, and more, it looks no different from a small local restaurant that you would find in a Japanese film. Furthermore, when the local gangsters turn up, and unfortunately I couldn't find a still of this, and they take their shirts off to reveal their back tattoos, they resemble Yakuza, of course. But because they're Taiwanese Yakuza, and we all know Taiwanese are lovable losers, they're not menacing at all. They're comic rather than being dangerous, scary Yakuza. So even when transposed to Taipei, the remake of Six Suspects still looks Japanese in many ways, because Taipei in the 1960s still looked Japanese in many ways. Six Suspects has the look of a relatively high budget Taiwanese language film. It was mostly shot on sets in a studio, and I'm sure this restaurant you can see here was built in the studio. But generally speaking, the very low budgets that characterize Taiwanese language films meant they did a lot of location shooting because they couldn't afford to build sets. And as a result, the architectural impact of the colonial period is naturally and easily evident in many of the films, including sliding doors, tatami mats, but also Japanese Art Deco. As you know, in the 1930s, European Art Deco got a very distinctive Japanese version that was built all over Taiwan, and you can see it there. Wang Chunqi notes that in his earlier melodrama, In the Husband's Secret, also based on Japanese sources, and I quote, "The camera placement is relatively low, sometimes close to the ground." Let's just go back to this, like this, especially in scenes with a Japanese-styled room setting. And the viewer is immediately reminded of films directed by Yasujiro Ozo and Mikio Naruse. Okay. One more. All right. Low budgets confined most shoots for the films to Taiwan, but that didn't prevent many filmmakers from imagining an accessible world beyond Taiwan. The young woman protagonist of the Gothic romance, The Bride Who's Returned from Hell, is depicted at the beginning of the film as just having returned from Singapore, where she's been teaching, and come back to Taiwan to investigate her sister's disappearance. Julie mentioned a film called Back to Anping Harbor a few minutes ago. And of course, that's a film where we have a Dutch sea captain who turns up, albeit played by a Taiwanese star in a big red furry wig and beard. And the characters go to study, one of the characters goes to study in America. So there's the imagination of going overseas that way. Taiwanese language filmmakers, therefore, did not entirely avoid setting their films in locations that were supposedly off the island. But they only chose locations that were plausible for films that were actually shot in Taiwan and also on the capitalist side of the Cold War divide. And that's because they didn't have the budgets to travel. They actually didn't have the budgets to travel to the south of Taiwan, usually, never mind outside Taiwan. So Dangerous Youth, for example, is supposedly set in Hong Kong. And this is mostly signified by references in the dialogue to saying things like, let's go drink tea at the Peninsula Hotel, or shall I meet you at Causeway Bay? But stock footage of the iconic Star Ferry on Victoria Harbour is played every now and then to try to make up for the absence of actual footage of any characters in the actual Peninsula Hotel or going to Causeway Bay. In Tarzan and the Treasure, it's the hills outside Taipei that function as the uplands of Malaysia. And there's also a side trip to what is supposed to be Macau, but is actually some generic back streets in Taipei. If Japanese elements appear in the films as familiar legacy, and the territories where Chinese live on the capitalist side of the Cold War divide are imaginable and imagined as places Taiwanese audiences might visit, Western material culture also appears in the films as part of a newly emergent capitalist Cold War culture of cosmopolitanism. Whereas socialist Cold War cosmopolitanism developed its own aspirational vision of modernity, but one focused on self-sacrifice and the development of production. On the capitalist side, the vision was of individual wealth and Western consumer culture, and these were quite emphasized in Taiyupian with contemporary settings. For example, although The Bride from Hell is transposed to Taiwan, its setting is in a very large Western-style house that immediately signifies the upper middle class. There's a chauffeur who drives a massive boat-like American car, somehow managing to maneuver it around the streets of Kaohsiung. I think that's where it is, maybe, anyway, wherever it's meant to be. All the young characters dress in expensive Western-style 1960s fashions, the men in suits and the women in pencil skirts. The protagonists of Dangerous Youth are equally fascinated with Western youth culture, but they're disaffected and less well off. So the young man rides a moped and wears a Hawaiian shirt. A location that we see in many films is the nightclub. And the nightclub, I think, is really interesting. And therefore, I want to stop share for a moment and share a clip. I've got, if I can get it here, just excuse me for a moment. I've got the trailer that the Taiwan Film Archive put together for another Lin Tuanqiu film. No, this is a Xinqi film, I think. Well, I have to look it up afterwards. Sorry. May 13th, Night of Sorrow. And this is using... Lin Tuanqiu. It is Lin Tuanqiu, isn't it? Yeah, I was right the first time. So this is a trailer they put together. It's not a trailer from the time, but it uses the opening nightclub sequence. And I'm going to see if I can do share screen again and show it to you. So let's see if we can do this. And let's go full screen. Oh, I need to check if, I'm not sure if I let me stop again and put the sound on. Sorry about this. I just remembered that. We have to share sound. Okay, so I think, okie doke. Let's go full screen, and here we go. Okay, so, just now to conclude, it's worth noting that although the nightclub is connoted as a kind of bridgehead of racy, exciting, and dangerous American modernity in Taiwan, of course, no Americans appear in Taiyupian. Excuse me. This absence of any American presence is despite the fact that there were US military bases all over the island during the Cold War, along with the nightclub culture that they spawned. At its peak, there were 19,000 American soldiers based in Taiwan. No doubt, any direct reference to the bases would not have got through censorship, and all these films were, of course, heavily censored. The absence of any reference to the existence of GIs and American bases on Taiwan is part of a wider pattern of what I would call a culture of tacit compliance without commitment that characterizes the response of Taiyupian producers and audiences to the Cold War situation they found themselves in. The Cold War is a binary logic that demands total affiliation to one side or the other. And therefore, any local opposition, depending on which side of the divide you're on, would have been very dangerous, possibly unthinkable. Therefore, the way to deal with this situation as filmmakers was to entirely omit the geopolitical and ideological underpinnings of the Cold War. And that's why, apart from Fantasy of the Deer Warrior, I can't really see much sign of the Cold War as directly represented in the films. But I want to argue that that absence is the way in which the Cold War shapes the films. But while the Taiyupian avoided these political issues, direct political issues, they enthusiastically took on the cosmopolitan and materialistic aspects of capitalist Cold War culture, turning to countries and cultures they regarded as advanced and aspired to match for plots, music, costumes, settings, and more. Of course, all of these countries are on the capitalist side of the Cold War divide. Combining these elements, Taiyupian built an inventive Taiwanese Cold War cosmopolitan film culture that is both specific to Taiwan and at the same time shaped by and responding to larger regional and global patterns. Michel de Certeau distinguishes between the strategies of those whose economic and political domination enables them to produce the environment, and the tactics of those who are subjected to those strategies. The Taiwanese language cinema emerges in this account as a tactical culture that carved out ways to survive and thrive in a Cold War environment largely beyond its control. In an era when that binary and totalizing logic is being reasserted in the name of a second Cold War, understanding such tactical cultures may have a new relevance. Thank you very much.